But it's a real honor to be here and really appreciated the opportunity to start with the history. And I really want to say thank you in particular to Howard for getting this ball rolling, because it's really important. And you know, one of the things I've noticed about Howard, I've had a chance to observe him a few times at TPF and other events, he's actually quite modest and does not lift up all of the history. And you know, one of the things I think that it's important to remember about history is you never know you're making it when you're making it. And I was in Baltimore last year, right? At a conference, national conference of the Association of Black Foundation Executives. And they come together once a year to examine both the life of African Americans who work in the sector, but also, more importantly, the impact of philanthropy on the African American community. And at that particular conference, they chose to lift up a couple of examples of really key initiatives happening in the country that are sort of leading the way and having a huge impact. And the Prosperity Foundation was one of those initiatives being profiled at that national conference. And that's not by accident, because the Association of Black Foundation Executives have had an opportunity to see what's happening from coast to coast, from community to community, and to understand, you know, what's been working and what hasn't, and really understand how important it is to lift up those things that have the most promise. And so I want you to understand that you are a part of history being made. The Prosperity Foundation is making history. And it's a really important thing to remember, not just because it's historic, but because it's going to really bring about the changes that, frankly, we've been looking for a long time. I see the Prosperity Foundation very much in the tradition of the Freedmen's Bank, okay? That was supposed to hold a lot of promise and potential for us as a people. And, you know, I think we can go over the history of all the different initiatives. And you know, this is the point in the speech where the speech writer is supposed to then sort of have this pithy quote, right? That, you know, would then lift that up. And I think we all sort of have our own favorite sort of quote, that one line from Black history. I know mind is a terrible thing to waste. We all know that, right? And there's a reason we all know that one. Because that organization, the United Negro College Fund, was built and resourced to last. And that's what this conversation is about tonight. How do we build to last so that we can build to success? As the former executive director of Associated Black Charities in New York City, I'm acutely focused on the importance of creating vehicles manifesting the will and interests of African Americans on our own behalf. And that's really the significance and the power of being able to be here with you. Because there's lots of organizations and lots of efforts and initiatives, but very few that really have, as Howard said, that laser focus about why we're here and where we're going. And so I really am really honored to be able to be here and to be a part of this kind of conversation. History is clear that the greatest results flow from what a community can do for itself. I'm going to say that again. History is very clear that the greatest results flow from what a community can do for itself. And when we examine the needs of the African American community, there's no shortcut that will work to resolve the centuries of disenfranchisement, divestment, and discrimination that have been experienced by African Americans. Long journeys, however, therefore require resources, planning, and strategy. Long-term strategy in the nonprofit sector requires that we build assets, which can be the bridge to the future in good times and the bridge over troubled waters in hard times. The Prosperity Foundation and Associated Black Charities, where I once worked, have something in common: a grant from the Kellogg Foundation. I was able, in that position, to organize a national collaboration of similar organizations 20 years ago into a project collaboration team to receive one of the earliest grants from Kellogg in their Philanthropy and Communities of Color portfolio. National collaborations in the Hispanic, Asian, Native American, and African American communities were funded to explore what it takes to promote philanthropy in communities of color. Now, I was always really intrigued with this project because, as studies have shown, Emmett Carson being the scholar we were trying to remember earlier, who really, I think, pioneered some of that research, people of color have historically been proportionately more philanthropic than anyone, and have done so with less. However, that philanthropy was funneled through trusted community institutions and did not look like what the majority community calls philanthropy. More often than not, that giving also turned right back around and went to immediate needs in the community, like food assistance, clothing, emergency shelter, etc. As a result, there's been very little opportunity to grow assets for troubled times, since it looked like we were living through troubled times all the time. I remember in my last position before this one at the Oliver Scholars Program, living through the national recession. And you know, when it's a recession for America, it's what for the rest of us, right? And wondering if we were going to make it, truly wondering. And I had to prepare this report for my board about our prospects and did some comparative research of my peer organizations. I don't like to call them competitors, they're peer organizations. And they all had, whatever you wanted to call it, reserve funds, endowments, whatever the case may be, so they could ride that period out. And I ended up, going into an organization that had no reserve fund, that had no endowment, that, was really on the ropes, to be honest. And, being resourceful, I came up with a whole variety of plans. I have an old roommate of mine who's currently the first African-American chair of the U.S. Fencing Association. He went to Wharton Business School. So I wrote up this plan, I sent it to him, I was like, think this will fly? He's like, yeah, it's pretty good for someone that didn't go to business school. And so I took it to my board. And they got worried because they were like, oh, wait, no, we didn't hire you to do that. We hired you to do this other thing. It's like, well, I'm looking for the money to do that. And so they said, well, oh, okay, we get it. Relax, stay focused. And they created an endowment fund. That organization is now twice the size that it was when I left, because they understood I couldn't do what I was supposed to do if they weren't doing what they were supposed to do to make that happen. Now, churches in the Black community were the first to show the power of growing assets for long-term projects and needs. And that is what we would need to do more of, frankly, in the future, as government is retrenching by shrinking the social safety net, which is available to needy communities. As Executive Director of Associated Black Charities, I attempted to do that asset building as well in that conversation with Kellogg. Upon receiving the grant for philanthropy in communities of color, all the recipient organizations were invited to a meeting in Battle Creek, Michigan, where Kellogg is headquartered, to talk about the grant and its implications with each other and with Kellogg. As we were approaching the end of our time in Battle Creek, we were asked whether there were any additional ideas or thoughts that we wanted to share. And I offered that, as generous as our grant was from Kellogg, promoting long-term goals like philanthropy in communities of color required assets, like shares of stock, which Kellogg could offer. They're sitting on it. Now, initially, our Kellogg program officer assumed I was ending the meeting with a really good joke, and eventually understood how serious I was. Because it really does not matter what little bits of income that we can get from time to time. It really is important that we be able to have that asset that can begin to throw off some income for us as well. And I wasn't expecting them to like walk into the vault and hand me shares right then and there. I mean, it was really about kind of trying to raise the idea of applying the same standard of philanthropy to us that they did to themselves. So if they wanted to talk about philanthropy in communities of color, do it the way that they do it. They sit on assets. They invest assets. The assets produce income, and then they use the income to apply to various needs. Both the ideas of equity and equality required as much. Treat us the same way and treat us fairly. Now, we have, come to a point where various versions of that conversation have happened. I don't know how many of you remember Mr. Foreman going into the church back in the 1960s, talking about reparations that needed to be created to put that money in a fund so that we could take care of those needs for ourselves. So this is nothing new. This is not innovative, but I'm crystal clear that we will need to build our own assets in order to fund our needs as a community. And so I'm really honored to be here to have this particular conversation with you and to really commend the Prosperity Foundation for having that focus and for understanding just how important it is to lift up each of these funds to the extent to which they can be the bedrocks for what goes forward as an organization. Kellogg, Motorola, Honda, Gates, Ford, Rockefeller Foundation, none of them are going to build our endowments for us. They're not going to do it. I tried. All of these foundations are able to function in perpetuity because of their endowments and their asset management. Now, as social dynamics in America and Connecticut get more dire, all of this will require even more collaboration, communication, and strategic planning than ever. Innovative projects and agreements allowing mutual fundraising and economic development to flourish as tools for social welfare will become even more necessary. Our state and federal governments, regardless of party, are sending a clear message very different from the one that Senator Kerry sent when he was running for president. Help is not on the way. Let's be clear. Help is not on the way. I think they've made it as clear as they possibly can. And so we're going to have to do that, to a great extent ourselves. So as the help is being withdrawn and the conditions are really getting even worse, it's going to need to trigger that help that we need from our own efforts. So let us pull together in the spirit of Harambe and create a year-round Ujima and Ujamaa of cooperative economics and collective work and responsibility, not just during the celebration of Kwanzaa once a year. The well-being of our children and our elders is our responsibility year-round. One of these responsibilities is to build, sustain, and grow institutions like the Prosperity Foundation, as we never have enough tools and resources on hand to do our work. As a part of that responsibility, let us also support the growth and development of our community's prosperity that fuels our own philanthropy. Our community needs businesses, our people need jobs, and our families must have the wherewithal to raise children and secure our future independent of the whims, wishes, and trends of other communities. All successful communities live by this code, and we must follow such universal principles if we wish to succeed. Thanks again to the founders and leaders and supporters of the Prosperity Foundation for seeing the importance of this dynamic. Thank you very much.